back here, or where should I say while I'm introducing? I'm just going to leave this here.
I want to offer you guys the opportunity. There is PowerPoint during today's talk, so I want to offer you the opportunity for those of you who want to move toward the center. If you're on the very edge, you probably won't be able to see the PowerPoint, and you should feel free to move around while I'm talking. I won't mind. But I want to first open by thanking all of you for coming to the inaugural event of the 2008-2009 State of Democracy Lecture Series. Our roster looks to be very dynamic this year, and please be sure to come back on December 5th to hear the ever-controversial Charles Murray. As always, we are grateful to Betsy Levitt-Cohn and Alan Cohn, the Alan K. Campbell Institute, and the Maxwell Dean's Office for their ongoing support of the series. And today we are fortunate to begin this year's series with a talk by Nancy Foner on the intriguing question of what's new about contemporary immigration. Professor Foner is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She received a Bachelor of Arts from Brandeis University and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. And for many of us who study immigration, Professor Foner's career is one to aspire to. She's authored an extraordinary number and range of books and articles that wind together themes that resonate for all Americans: race, gender, nationality, work, urban life, and, of course, immigration. She's also been recognized as an expert on the immigrant experience by scholarly foundations such as Russell Sage, as well as congressional commissions on migration, and cultural institutions, including several museums that represent the immigration experience, the immigrant experience. Professor Foner's most recent book, In a New Land, A Comparative View of Immigration, won the Choice Award for Outstanding Title in 2006. Prior to that, she edited a volume entitled Wounded City, The Social Impact of 9/11, and another, Not Just Black and White, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives on Immigration, Race, and Ethnicity in the United States, that was honored by the American Sociological Association. In the future, keep your eyes open for her forthcoming collaborative research comparing the Dutch, British, German, French, and American experiences of immigration, and in particular, religious diversity. Following the talk by Professor Foner, Professor Jamie Winders, Assistant Professor of Geography at the Maxwell School, will offer a brief set of comments and responses. Professor Winders received her Bachelor of Arts in Geography from the University of Kentucky and a PhD in Geography, also from the University of Kentucky. And her work employs a diverse set of approaches in the study of race and immigration and the impact of immigration on urban politics and low-wage workplaces. In addition to their remarkable professional achievements, Professors Foner and Winders bring a truly exceptional body of first-hand knowledge and insight to the discussion today. They have both done the kind of qualitative work that brings them in direct contact with the subjects of their studies. Even in the very rich field of immigration research, this is a rarity and something that many of us value immensely. The format for today's event will begin with a talk by Professor Foner. Professor Winders will then offer her response and comments. And following that, we will open up the discussion to questions from all of you. Around 5:30, we will adjourn, and we invite everyone here to join us for a reception and informal conversation right outside the auditorium. And I would like to say, because all of us assembled here today share a very keen interest in intellectual discussions about immigration, I would like to express an especially warm collective welcome on behalf of the Maxwell School to our distinguished guest, Nancy Foner.
Oh, thank you so much for such a warm and introduction and welcoming introduction. Okay. I'm delighted to be here. Actually, I'm even more, I don't know how many of you knew that I attempted to come here in the spring, and the plane never took off. There was touch and go this morning, I want you to say, in New York, when New York was kind of fogged in. However, so I'm especially delighted that I've actually made it here today, and of course to meet people and to talk with you about immigration. So let me get right down to it. Okay, you see the title of my talk is What's New About Contemporary Immigration. As everybody here I'm sure knows, we're in the midst now of a massive immigration that's transforming the United States, and it has been transforming the United States for the past 4 or 5 decades. And this is something that also happened 100 years ago. So what I want to do in my talk this afternoon is ask some basic questions that put the contemporary immigration in historical perspective. Actually, some of you may know some of my work from before, in which I'm very New York oriented. And actually today I'm going to try to have a more U.S. perspective, not just focus. New York, I'm known as being someone who is very focused, New York centric, I think one might call it. But I'm going to look beyond New York to the country as a whole. So there are 3 main questions that I'm going to look at. One is history repeating itself? And in some ways, as I'm going to talk about, the answer is yes. There are many parallels with the past when we're talking about immigration and the immigrant experience. But we're also not just witnessing a timeless immigrant saga. In many ways, today's immigration differs very profoundly from the past. So the question, what's new about immigration and the immigrant experience today? And third, and this is something I'm only going to be able to talk about very briefly, but I wanted to bring it up. So much of my own work has been a kind of comparing the past and the present. But I think that there's another issue that comes up when we're looking at the role of history and how history can help us understand the contemporary immigrant experience. And that is how the legacy of the past has helped to shape the immigrant experience today. So just a very brief words about why I think a historical comparison of then and now is important. I think, for one thing, there's been a tendency to look back with nostalgia to immigrants in a so-called golden age of immigration, to romanticize or glorify the experiences of immigrants in the past, to look at them with rose-colored glasses, is another way that's commonly said, and to see immigrants in the past and today as overwhelmingly different, to see today's immigrants as overwhelmingly different from the past and inferior. And I think a historical comparison makes clear that this is wrong. And by the way, historians would say this is their main contribution. They emphasize very much the continuities between past and present, and they think actually that social sciences put too much emphasis on the differences. A comparison of past and present can help us to understand what's unique about each immigration era, what's more general to the American migration experience. By acquainting us with what's gone on before, I think a comparative approach can inspire a critical awareness of what's taken for granted in our own time. And this is something that I've come to feel, I'm going to add this point on, and after years of teaching students, particularly at the City University of New York, this is something that I've become very sensitive to. I think that viewing today's immigration in light of the past is valuable for immigrants today. I teach in my classes, almost all of my students are either immigrants or children of immigrants, and actually, even though they live in New York, they know almost nothing about immigration in the past, so they're not nostalgic. They don't have any view, really, of immigrants in the past. But I think because this historical comparison is valuable for students in my classes, also because it brings out that immigrants before have also struggled and experienced difficulties when they came to the U.S. So I'm going to be talking about what I often refer to as the 2 great immigration waves of the past 125 years. The last great wave between the 1880s and early 1920s, and the present wave, which began in the late 1960s and is still going strong. So let me just briefly go through 6 parallels with the past. The first is pretty obvious, but it needs to be said. We're not experiencing large-scale immigration for the first time. Early 20th century America was as much an immigrant country as it is today. And here are the figures on immigrants. This is immigrants as a percentage of the U.S. population. And you can see that in 2006, we're up to 12.5%, call it 13%. But look back at 1900, 1910, and 1920, and you will see that the percentage was actually higher then. So we have not reached, the immigrants are still a growing percentage. I mean, if you look at the last several decades, you can see the percentage is growing. But we still haven't reached the early 20th century levels. Second, immigrant place in the economy, because many immigrants arrive today with low skill levels, don't know English, and are new to the country, like their predecessors 100 years ago, or I should say 125 years ago. They often enter the economy on the bottom, taking low-paid jobs with long hours, unpleasant working conditions that nobody else wants. Italians in the past dug ditches and tunnels. Today, many Mexicans wash dishes, and actually many of them are also digging, I don't know about tunnels, but they're digging ditches. A lot of Mexicans actually are working in construction, and some of the jobs are even exactly the same, working in garment sweatshops, for example, taking care of the gardens and children of the well-to-do. In terms of where immigrants live, there's a whole lot of similarities, but let me just mention a few. Many newcomers today, like those a century ago, cluster in ethnic residential enclaves, often sharing homes or apartments with people from their home communities and giving many neighborhoods a distinct ethnic flavor. They do this partly because they can't afford to live anywhere else, partly because they experience prejudice, but also because of choice. They often choose to live in neighborhoods with friends and relatives from their home community in places with familiar institutions and languages. Also, their low incomes and recent entry into the housing market force many immigrant families, today as in the past, into crowded, sometimes substandard living quarters and to rent out space to their compatriots in order to make ends meet. Fourth, the question of race, and this is something that I've written a lot about. It's often said that a major distinction between today's immigrants and those 100 years ago is that then they were white Europeans, and today immigrants are mostly people of color. But that's really looking at this with early 21st century eyes. Southern and Eastern European immigrants a century ago were not viewed as white in the same way that people with origins in Northern and Western Europe were, say the Irish or the Germans. The Italians and Jews, which is the group that I focus on the most, although they actually were the largest groups 100 years ago, they were seen as inferior whites. As historians have various terms to try to capture how they were seen, probationary whites, some historians call them, or in-between peoples is a popular phrase, not black, not white. 100 years ago, a common belief was that Southern Italian and Eastern European Jewish immigrants belonged to inferior mongrel races. They were thought to be, they were spoken of as races, that were polluting the nation's Anglo-Saxon or Nordic stock. It was felt that they would never be able to assimilate, that they would always remain apart, and that they were ruining America, basically. Vice President Campbell, he became vice president, but he wrote this in a very popular magazine. America must be kept American. Biological laws show that Nordics deteriorate when mixed with other races. That was a very big concern, race mixing. It was felt that that was going to ruin America. Jewish and Italian immigrants were believed to have distinct biological features, mental abilities, and innate character traits. To most Americans, they looked different, and they were thought to have certain physical features that set them apart. In the case of Italians, it was swarthy skin. It was, you read endless accounts of Italians. It's always the swarthy Italians. They were thought. The Jews, it was facial features. It was very often their noses. In fact, and I really think this is, I have this up here because I think it's an amazing study. There was actually a professor of medicine at NYU, Maurice Fishberg. He himself was an Eastern European immigrant who classified, in his study, he classified the noses of 3,000 Jewish men in New York City. And basically he did this to refute the stereotype of the Jewish nose. And he found that only 14% had the aquiline or hooked nose commonly labeled as a Jewish nose. I mean, that gives you an idea of what was happening at the time. Fifth, transnational ties. I don't know how many of you, some of you who are students may have read about this. Transnationalism, or maintaining political, social, economic, and cultural ties to the home country, is not a new invention. In the writings about transnationalism that began in the 1990s, it was often treated by social scientists as something that was new to the contemporary era. I should say that most social scientists have backtracked on this, and they agree it's not new. However, it is worth emphasizing that point. Many immigrants in the last great wave of immigration maintained extensive transnational ties. They sent money and letters to relatives back home. They put away money to buy land and houses in the home community. Large numbers of Italians engaged in circular migration, and they were often referred to as birds of passage. They would go back to their home community seasonally, sometimes every few years, in some cases even every year. And many immigrants in a variety of groups remained actively involved in the politics of the homeland, raising considerable amounts of money, by the way, for political parties and so on in the homeland. Some homeland governments, and Italy was a prime example of this, were also involved with their citizens in the U.S., subsidizing organizations to help them, for example, and facilitating the flow of remittances homeward. Italy, just like many countries today, was very dependent on remittances coming in from abroad and wanted to ensure that they continued to flow, and so actually was involved with setting up banks in the United States to make it easier for immigrants to do that. Learning English. A common fear is that today's immigrants and their children are not learning English, and that this is different from the past. And I should say, when my book From Ellis Island to JFK came out, I gave a lot of talks in New York. And I would give all my talks, and then there would be a hand that would go up in the audience. It was almost inevitable. And someone would say, but my grandparents or my parents, when they came to New York, they know English. And immigrants today don't know English. This was very disappointing to me after my talk. So now I've inserted something specifically about this, because when it comes to language, the similarities with the past stand out. And the fears that immigrants and their children today will not learn English are unfounded. The standard three-generation model of linguistic assimilation still holds. The immigrant generation, arriving as adults, I'm not talking now about those who come as young children, makes some progress, but is usually more comfortable and fluent in the native tongue. This is true today, and it was true in the past. The second generation, by the second generation, I mean the children of immigrants who are born in the U.S., is bilingual. Not all, by the way. Some of them are monolingual, but large numbers are bilingual. They speak English and they speak their parents' home country language. The third generation is overwhelmingly monolingual in English. In the second generation today, the vast majority has made the transition to English. They're much more likely to speak English fluently than their immigrant parents. They're far less likely than their parents to speak with a strong accent. And this is true even in parts of the U.S. where Spanish is widely spoken and when the media in the parents' original language are widely available. A recent study by the Pew Research Center showed that 88% of second-generation Latinos, 18 and older, spoke English very well, versus about a quarter of first-generation Latino immigrants. I have to say, for those, the data, they're self-report data, so there may be a slight overestimate here, right? But still, I think that you can see the figures. In short, there is little evidence, and I think all social scientists most would agree with this, that maintaining the parental language comes at the expense of English fluency, even among those groups in which second-generation bilingual is common. And the groups, the Spanish-speaking groups are the ones for whom second-generation bilingualism is the most common. Many Asian immigrant children don't speak or sometimes actually even lose the parental language. Once again, by the third generation, English monolingualism is the dominant pattern, over 90% for Asian groups and as high as 2/3 for the Mexican third generation. Okay, now we get to the contrasts. And there are many contrasts between then and now. And they stand out. Here, I think it's very important to emphasize these as well as the parallels and the continuities, because there are obviously contrasts for many reasons. The immigrants themselves are different who are coming to America. America is a different place. In fact, the world is a different place. And so there is much that is new about the immigrant story today. So first, something a little bit about the flows or who the immigrants are. 100 years ago, the overwhelming majority of immigrants to the U.S. were from Europe, mainly from Eastern and Southern Europe. Italians, as I mentioned before, were the largest group of immigrants in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, followed by Eastern European Jews. In 1920, an astounding 94% of the nation's immigrants were European. So that's a kind of astounding figure, right? This was a European immigrant country. 87 years later, in 2007, 13% of the immigrants in the U.S. are Europeans. So this is a very big change in where immigrants are coming from. In 2007, nearly 4 out of 5 immigrants were from Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean. About a quarter, this is those living in the United States. I want to just make that clear. It's not those who came in 2007. About a quarter were from Asia, and 55% from Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see the top groups here. I've just got the top 10. And you can see that Mexico just overwhelmingly dominates. Okay, 31.3% of immigrants in the United States in 2007 were Mexican. And it comes out quite starkly because look at the next group, Chinese. They represent 5.4%. That's a rather big difference, right? So Mexicans, that's why there's so much focus on Mexican immigration, because they are overwhelmingly the largest group coming here, living in the United States. And you see the next group is China and India and so on. You can see these are the largest groups in the country as a whole. Obviously, the numbers, the groups are going to differ in different locations as to which groups dominate, but this is for the whole country. Immigrants may be a lower percentage of the nation's population than in 1910, but their actual numbers are much larger. And let me just show you here the figure. This is not percentages. This is the actual numbers in the millions, okay? So if we look at 1920, say, then there were 13.9 million immigrants in the United States. That was at a time after there had been several decades of very heavy immigration. Look today, 2006. 37.5 million immigrants. That is an unprecedented number. So the what?
Are the recent numbers ICE numbers?
No, these are American Community Survey. These are census figures. Yeah, no, not ICE. No. These are census. For those who do research, they know, right? It has to be census. But we have American Community Survey figures now. Yeah. Another difference between now and then, having to do with unauthorized immigrants, which is obviously a huge issue in the United States today. 100 years ago, there were few restrictions on European immigration, and let me emphasize European here, so that hardly any European immigrants were illegal. But remember, 94% of the immigrants in the U.S. were European. So this was, until the 1920s, there were no numerical limits on European immigration. Numerical limits came in 1924. Before that, there were no numerical limits on European immigration. For Europeans, there were no immigrant visas that you had to get, no special papers that had to be secured from the U.S. Now, I'm emphasizing Europeans because other groups, particularly Asians, were subject to restrictions. Starting in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, Asians were subject to severe restrictions and, in fact, exclusion from entering. But for Europeans, there were no numerical restrictions. They basically, as I say here, had to get on the boat. That was the big thing. Most got through the ports of entry fairly easily, most famously Ellis Island, since they had already been screened mainly for disease by steamship companies before being allowed on the boat. What happened is, it was in 1901, the U.S. actually passed a law which said that the steamship companies were responsible for taking immigrants back to Europe if they didn't get through inspection at Ellis Island. So the steamship companies had an interest in people getting through Ellis Island because they didn't want to have to pay. And so they instituted their own inspections in Europe. So the big thing actually was being able to get on the boat. That was the hard part. And actually immigrants, if you read accounts from those days, were nervous about that. It's particularly on the basis of health. I mean, they were very nervous. But if you got on the boat and got to Ellis Island, you were pretty much home free. Only 1% of the 25 million immigrants who landed at Ellis Island before World War I were excluded. And I think people are sometimes surprised by that fact, because much is made of how horrible it was in Ellis Island and all the people who got turned away, right? I mean, that's part of the myth, I think. I think actually it's a myth. most people got through Ellis Island pretty quickly, certainly in a day. I mean, there were some people who were detained for a while in the hospitals, but most people got through fairly easily. Today, obviously very different. If you don't have authorization by U.S. authorities, you cannot legally live and work in the United States. There are numerical limits on the number of immigrant visas, and in many countries, a long wait to get them, and even if you have a family member to sponsor you. And most immigrants who migrate to the United States legally come under the family reunification provisions of U.S. immigration law. In 2007, I didn't give all the different years, but just to give you an idea, a U.S. citizen wanting to sponsor an unmarried adult child from Mexico or the Philippines had to wait more than 15 years before the application would be processed. There are especially long waits from Mexico. Philippines is another one, and India is another one. I mean, they're really, really long waits. So people don't want to wait 15 years, right? Therefore, many people don't have family members to sponsor them either. So they come without proper they come sometimes as tourists and overstay their visas. Many do come that way. That's also hard to do, but okay, many manage to do that. Or else they come across the border without proper papers or proper documents. The latest estimates, as many of you probably read about in the press, is some 11 to 12 million unauthorized immigrants live in the United States, more than half of them from Mexico. Third difference is the social and economic backgrounds of immigrants. Not only is there a remarkable diversity of immigrants today in terms of the countries that they come from, but also their social and economic background. Many immigrants still, as in the past, have low skill levels, poor levels of education. Most of the European immigrants who came 100 years ago were not highly skilled and had low levels of education. That continues, as you can see from these figures. About a third of the nation's foreign-born, adult foreign-born in 2006 did not have a high school diploma. But what's new is that a very substantial minority of immigrants come highly educated. People are often not aware of this either, but 27%, that's more than a quarter of the adult immigrants in the United States have a college degree or more. So that never before have we seen so many immigrants coming with such a high proportion coming with such high qualifications. In terms of where immigrants live, there are lots of differences, but I just want to point out a few here, just in terms of where they're going. 100 years ago, most immigrants went to live in the Northeast and Midwest. That's where 80% in 1920 of immigrants in the U.S. lived. Of course, that's where most native-born Americans lived. That's where people were living. Today, the United States is a different place. And many more immigrants, large numbers, go to the Southwest, West, and South, most notably California, Texas, and Florida. And I have down here the states with the largest immigrant populations. California is number one, as you can see, with almost 10 million immigrants, followed by New York, yay, right, with 4.1 million. But if I may inject a New York City-centric element here, although there are 4.1 million immigrants in New York State, a little over 3 million of them live in the 5 boroughs of New York City. So New York City still has a lot of immigrants. Florida has 3.5 million, Texas 3.4 million, New Jersey, which is in the New York metro, a lot of them are in the New York metro area there, 1.9 million, Illinois 1.7 million, and Georgia, which is where immigrants have begun to go in larger numbers, almost 1 million. Jobs in the economy, given that a substantial number of today's immigrants have college degrees, some bring substantial amounts of foreign capital with them, it's not surprising that many arrive ready and able to find decent, often high-level jobs in the mainstream economy. This is a difference from the past, and also because we now live in an economy where service jobs are much more dominant and fewer people work in factories, immigrants are following suit. Legal status, just to emphasize this again, wasn't an issue for immigrants 100 years ago, or European immigrants, I should say, 100 years ago. Today, obviously, it is. Having a green card is not a recipe for success, but without one, an immigrant has much more trouble getting a good job in the formal economy and making a living wage, and this has enormous ramifications for their own lives and something that is just beginning to be studied by social scientists for their children's lives as well. Now, what's new about transnationalism? A lot. With modern technology and communications, immigrants can maintain a kind of contact with their home communities that was simply impossible 100 years ago. It took 2 weeks 100 years ago to get back to Italy. If you sent a letter, you wrote your letter, it took 2 weeks to get there, and if the person replied immediately, it would take another 2 weeks to get to you, so that's not that satisfying, right? People today can be involved with relatives and friends in their home communities. They pick up the phone. It's not just that they have ability to, I mean, phone calls have gotten cheap phone calls, right, as we all know, right? And not only that, there are cell phone towers all over the world now, okay? People can have their new types of communication, such as email, video types, video conferencing. I was asking the students in my class just last week about how they maintain contact, and a number of students raised their hand and said they were doing it through Skype, although that you have to have that, available in the home country. I had the case of Jamaica, I just wanted to give you an idea of just the enormous changes, not even between 100 years ago, but between several decades ago. Jamaica is the place where Elizabeth mentioned doing qualitative research. That's where I did my field work in the late 1960s as an anthropologist. I actually wasn't studying migration, but it was obvious that people were leaving, that time beginning to come to the United States. But when I was in Jamaica in this village, where I lived for a year and a half, there was no phone. There were no phones. The only way, I always say, the only kind of instantaneous communication was by telegram, which went to the village postmistress, who, of course, read it. So it wasn't very private, and very few people did that. You would only do that in an emergency. As I was leaving, right after I left the community, they put in a phone. There was a phone booth in the village. I wouldn't call it the square, but we'll call it the village square, in the center of the village. Now, went out in different directions for about 5 miles. So if you wanted to make a call, you had to go down to make a call in this. I don't even know how you did it, because there were no phone cards in those days. It was pre-phone card day. Or if you wanted to receive a call, you'd have to coordinate it with someone who was abroad to call you at a particular time. So it wasn't the greatest, right? Subsequently, phone lines came in, but if anyone here knows Jamaica, they'll know that the phone lines, they didn't always work. Also, only better off people had phones. It wasn't that widespread. Today, and this is really something I would say of the last 10 years, maybe even less than that, a figure that I found just absolutely astounding. Jamaica has a little under 3 million people, about 2.8 million people. There are 2.1 million cell phones in Jamaica. I mean, that's an actually astounding figure, right? People have, and it's cheap. You can just call. So you've got people in the fields calling their relatives. And in fact, it's really changed the nature of relations between people in the home community and here. In fact, people who are here say it means often for them that people can just make that many more demands on them all the time for stuff to send back, that it's hard. I mean, there are interesting ramifications, something that is beginning to be studied. But the point is that makes it very, very different, the kinds of communication that can exist, even as opposed to 10 or 20 years ago. Just to mention one other way in which that's something that's been the subject, again, of a lot of literature, is the growing number of countries of origin that allow dual citizenship, so that many immigrants can vote in home country elections, some from the U.S., even after becoming U.S. citizens. Finally, I just want to mention this because I think this is actually very important, is that in the past there was a halt to mass immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in the 1920s as a result of legislative restrictions. The 1924 immigration law made it really, the numbers went way down after that. It became much more difficult to come to the United States. This was followed, of course, by the Great Depression. Well, I'm not going to say anything about that, right? What's going to happen, right? We can think about that. That's for a later talk after we go through our, let's hope we recover from the recession. It doesn't become a depression. But also followed by the Great Depression and World War II. And mass inflows from Eastern and Southern Europe did not begin again, or really mass inflows did not begin again until the 1960s. So that second generation Jews and Italians growing up and coming to adulthood in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s were doing so in a context in which there were hardly any newly arrived immigrants in their communities. And I think that made the assimilation process different for them. This is very different today when immigration has been continuing at high rates, and a halt like that in the past is unlikely. And just to give you some figures again, which I think are really quite remarkable, in 2006, 30% of immigrants in the United States had come between 1990 and 1999. Perhaps an even more remarkable figure is that 25% had come since 2000. So that in the last 6 years, a quarter of the immigrants in the United States had come just in those years. 55% of all the immigrants in the United States had come between 1990 and 2006. So we're really talking about a constant replenishment, large-scale replenishment of those groups already here. Many children of immigrants are growing up today in communities where newcomers, and of all ages, and bear that in mind, it's not just adults, it's children too, are arriving every day, bringing along home country customs, cultures, and languages. And I think that's, by the way, as a little footnote, I think that's the reason, to get back to the language issue, why there's often some confusion or misunderstanding about people learning English. Because when outsiders look at and they say, oh, everyone's speaking Spanish, they don't realize that many of the people that they see speaking Spanish, young children, right, or teenagers, only came, a year or two ago. I mean, they haven't been here very long. So, I mean, I think people think, oh, they're born here and they're not speaking English. Okay, let me just say a few words about how the legacy of the past shapes the present. Because it's not just a question of what's different from the past, but how the incorporation of immigrants in the past or the legacy of immigration has shaped the contemporary immigrant experience. In many established gateways like New York City, a variety of institutions were established early in the 20th century, often by immigrants themselves, to aid newcomers then. And I'm thinking here, for example, of labor unions. The Garment Workers Union is one, to settlement houses, which many immigrants benefit from today. In fact, I was at an event a month or so ago to celebrate a biography of Jacob Riis, and it was sponsored by the Jacob Riis houses, which were founded at that time, and which are still helping immigrants in New York today. Today's immigrants profit from the legitimacy of ethnic politics, dating back to the 19th century when the Irish were able to take over the helm, or perhaps more accurate, to become very dominant in big city democratic politics by mobilizing the ethnic vote. I don't have time to go into this, but I'm now involved in a project comparing immigration in the U.S. and Europe, and that is a big difference. I mean, ethnic politics is very legitimate. We have no problem with politicians making appeals along ethnic lines. That's become ingrained in the American way, but it wasn't always so, and it developed really during earlier immigrations in the 19th century. And it's important to add, too, that new immigrants and their children have also benefited from gains won by African Americans in the civil rights movement, affirmative action and diversity programs, for example, and a new etiquette about race and public discourse which condemns racial, religious, and ethnic slurs by public officials and candidates. And, of course, we've seen this, and, something, you remember the quote from Calvin Coolidge? He would never have been elected vice president saying that today, okay? To conclude, as we look at immigration in 21st century America, I think it's helpful to look at it with a historical sensibility to try to appreciate what's genuinely new about contemporary immigration as well as the ways that we've been there before. As the historian David Kennedy puts it very eloquently, the only way we can know with certainty as we move along time's path that we have come to a new place is to know something of where we have been. Comparing immigration today and in the past dispels myths about heroes and heroines from a glorious golden age of immigration in the past, and it reminds present-day immigrants, and I do come back to this point, of what they have in common with their predecessors, which can give them a greater sense of being part of America as a nation of immigrants, which is a term that actually came into wider use more in the post-World War II era, and perhaps also hope for the future. And there was a wonderful quote in the New York Times a few weeks ago, and I'd like to end with that, with a leader of an Arab-Muslim federation in Brooklyn who put it to the reporter in the New York Times. He said, "We look at the Italian community, the Jewish community. They started out like us or even worse off. Eventually the day will come for us." So I guess we have to hope that that's true. But it's, I think that this, they're putting it in a historical perspective, it links them up with the experiences of early immigrants, which were also difficult, and with their struggles as well. So let me end there, and then we can open it to discussion. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, not discussion. We're hearing from you. Sorry. Scratch that.
You were very short.
Sorry.
First, I want to thank Elizabeth for asking me to do this. This is an impossible task and no small act to follow, so thank you for giving me, asking me to provide commentary on this. I just want to speak, I'm going to put my watch here so I don't go over. Nancy's really provided a deeply comprehensive look at immigration that certainly goes far beyond New York City, that really looks at immigration past and present and sort of moves across time and space. She's literally covered much ground, and so we've gone from Italian birds of passage to current video mail between immigrants and their family elsewhere. She's shown very clearly how the present and the past sort of echo one another in terms of the scale, if not size, of immigration. In this politically charged process of language acquisition, both in past and present, in the existence, if not the actual forms, of transnational links, and in immigrants' place in local, national, and regional labor markets. But she also showed quite clearly how present immigration deviates from the past in terms of immigration geographies, where people are coming from, that shift from Europe to Latin America and Asia, where they're going to, the move away from just gateway cities to parts of the South and the Midwest. And we could add where they're settling in these places. So immigration has really become a rural, urban, and a suburban phenomenon across the U.S. She's shown us differences in terms of the increasingly policed, if not militarized, border and visa regimes that we're seeing at the same time that we're seeing continued high levels of immigration. And she also pointed to some of the differences in sort of the new political geographies of citizenship, as well as these transnational politics that we're increasingly seeing. And so Nancy's work really challenges not just to document that the present and the past of immigration geographies and experiences are linked, but really to analyze how that past, or sort of multiple interpretations of the past, informs present experiences and local and regional and national responses to immigration. And I think this latter question is really, really rich ground around the legacies of the past that Nancy's historical sensibility shows us. So what I'd like to do is just make some connections across her talk and really point to some of the ways that her work pushes my own sort of understandings of immigration. And I should say that my undergrads in a class on migration and mobility recently read some of Nancy's work, so all the good ideas that I have are actually probably theirs. But I did ask permission before I could steal what they said. So first I want to note, as Nancy notes, when we compare immigration past and present, we have to keep in mind, as she phrased it, that immigration has fundamentally changed, that the U.S. has substantially changed, and that the world itself has radically restructured a number of times. Nonetheless, in both a historical and a contemporary context, language acquisition for immigrants and their descendants have been deeply politicized. And so in thinking about that changing world in particular, I began to wonder in listening to Nancy talk how the current pressures we see in public discourse and rhetoric for almost an immediate English language acquisition, not across generations but in a few years, might link up to sort of the overall speeding up or time compression of something like globalization. So we could ask, is the demand for this instant English informed by sort of globalizing tendencies toward a faster world of instant results, Or, if we draw on Nancy's framework, might we see this current demand for sort of instant English acquisition as the mobilization of a very particular and very condensed history of immigrant experiences in the U.S., one, again, that draws on that golden age of immigration, but in a very deeply edited manner. And I think here we can really see the value of Nancy's reminder about understanding the histories of processes like language acquisition to intervene in some of these contemporary language debates. The second point I wanted to raise is I think Nancy's call for viewing immigration with a historical sensibility is particularly compelling, not only because it sheds light on contemporary immigrant experiences, but also because it encourages us to consider how the past is mobilized by multiple groups in sites of immigrant settlement and in immigrant politics more broadly, and also to what end these versions of the past are used. Now, I'm much more familiar with the non-traditional immigration destinations, where the one-third who aren't going to LA and Chicago and New York are going. And in these new destinations, multiple historical sensibilities are being mobilized for various political projects. So, for example, amidst growing anti-immigrant sentiment in Tennessee in 2006, an immigrant advocacy group began a PR campaign with billboards across cities asking residents to, quote, embrace the immigrant you once were. So it wants calling for immigrant inclusion by drawing on this presumed shared history of immigration and creating a racialized exclusion by erasing African Americans' experiences of forced migration and the Middle Passage. If we shift to a finer scale in some neighborhoods and cities like Nashville with growing immigrant population, a lot of long-term residents are turning to their own golden age of the early 20th century to redefine their current neighborhoods with an immigrant presence by literally redrawing neighborhood boundaries in place in the 1930s and renaming their neighborhoods based on names in use in the 20s and 1930s, thus kind of mobilizing, again, a particular nostalgic past to override a problematic presence. And I think Nancy's calls to historicize immigration really encourages us to examine what projects of inclusion or exclusion are bound up with these multiple historical sensibilities through which people make sense of immigration. So we could ask which and whose past is operationalized or deployed and to what end across immigration discussions and debates. Third, I was also really struck by Nancy's attention to questions of race, not just in this talk, but in her work more broadly, particularly the comparison between racial anxieties of the 1920s and of the post-9/11 era, and particularly in relation to the whole question of a depression. I think this unfortunately becomes particularly relevant today. Her work highlights that complicated process of, quote, becoming white for Italians and other groups in the early 20th century, as well as the often contradictory racializations of contemporary immigrants to the U.S. And so from this comparison, we can ask, in this period, in each of these periods, what's the role of whiteness as both that which needed protection, especially through the conflation with the category American, and that toward which immigrants were to strive? So given those changes she lays out in immigration in the U.S. and in the world between these two periods, how have the workings of whiteness been transformed, particularly vis-a-vis post-9/11 links between nation and race? Now, elsewhere in her work, Nancy discusses the, quote, New York way of multiculturalism and its potentially unique or different meaning in the Empire City, as well as its relevance as a key city for broader understandings. And I think this attention to geographic contingency and scale in discussions of race, diversity, and immigration are really key to thinking through the complexities of racialization vis-a-vis both historical and contemporary immigration and immigrants. And again, these raise all sorts of key questions for me. How, for example, might this new geography of immigration that we're seeing link up to its different racial and local, its different regional and local racial politics? How might the process of political and social inclusion through claims to whiteness that we can document for various immigrant groups in the early 20th century play out for current immigrants to the U.S.? So Will new immigrants, too, gain political and social inclusion in the national body on the backs of African Americans, as someone like Toni Morrison has suggested? Along the same lines, as other scholars have suggested, will a black, not black racial binary strengthen in a contemporary U.S. as immigrants are drawn into kind of a national grammar of race? And I think Nancy's historical sensibility helps us frame these questions, as well as helps us point again to those possible outcomes for political and social relations concerning immigrants and immigration. Finally, Nancy, I think, really effectively highlights, again in this talk, but also in her work more broadly, the continuance of these ethnic residential enclave development and settlement across the U.S. Now, as the geography of immigrant settlement spreads, however, these enclaves are starting to emerge in new places, and Nancy's own, her own work raises, I think, really challenging questions about what form these enclaves will take and how they'll function. So how, for example, will ethnic politics such as those that she studied in the context of New York City develop in places where immigration has been a phenomenon not for generations but maybe for less than a decade? So will we see a transference in sort of political currency and knowledge from these gateway cities to new destinations? And what might a comparison between very recent immigrant destinations that lack that sort of historical depth and very established locales like New York City show us about political formations, ethnic solidarity, and so on? And I think Nancy's work in particular is key in enabling such a comparison. The rest of us just have to catch up, to catch up to the work that she's doing so we can make these sorts of comparisons. I don't have answers to any of the questions that I've raised, but I think they're important to think about, and I think Nancy's work in particular sort of encourages us to reflect on these questions. So I'll stop here with a thanks to Nancy for such a rich talk. I'll trade chairs with you.
Okay, we're going to take some questions now, and so
It seems to me there are two. It seems to me there's a couple of themes that would be useful to explore, and time didn't permit, probably. One is the role to which U.S. intervention in various other countries has led to waves of immigration. I'm thinking particularly of Latin America, Guatemala, El Salvador in the 80s, Haiti, for example. I think it's important to look at. And also the role of deportation and how that's been different in the two eras under discussion. I'm just aware here in central New York that there is a lot of deportation going on in that it involves separation of families, breaking up of families. Was there a similar pattern of deportation and breaking up in families in the early 20th century?
No, not of that to the extent. I mean, this is actually, to take the deportation question first, I mean, that's really a recent, right? I mean, it's spurred on by U.S. legislation, which has made it easier to deport immigrants, and there are a growing number of immigrants who are deported, particularly for minor crimes. So, no, I think that that's something that's rising, actually, in the current period, and I don't think that was similar to the past. And, yes, you're right about U.S. intervention affecting immigration today in a way that wasn't the same as in the past, yes. I mean, we can think of endless, and also, U.S. refugee policy, Southeast Asians, for example. I mean, that's a product of the Vietnam War. And yes, I mean, clearly, if you look at which countries are sending large numbers of immigrants to the U.S., they're often countries in which the U.S. was involved, and often politically. So yes, but I wasn't able to get into that, and I think the deportation question is a very good one. So thanks for raising those.
Okay, Cubans have the wet foot, dry foot policy.
Pardon me?
Cuban
Yeah.
Cuban immigrants have the wet foot, dry foot policy in Florida, where where if they make it on land, they can stay.
Uh-huh.
If they were to open that up to other races, I guess, of oppressive regimes.
Well, I wouldn't call them races. National origin groups.
National origins. Thank you. If they were to open that up to other national origins, do they have any idea of how much the immigration numbers would spike?
I don't think they're likely to open that up to other national origin groups. So I think that's I think that's not a realistic question, really. I mean, Cuban migration is small, really, in terms of continuing now, and I mean the largest group in terms of undocumented immigrants is Mexicans, and that's a big political issue in the United States that we don't know what the answer is. I mean, as we saw in the election, it was not something that either of the candidates spoke about. You may have noticed. And according to, because it's too controversial and had the potential to alienate important segments of their constituencies that they didn't want to alienate. And, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal, I guess last week, I don't know if any of you saw it, which actually argued, the analysis was that it wasn't going to come up anytime soon either. I mean, given the state of the economy, which is obviously primary, that immigration may go on the back burner again for a while. I mean, I think so. And it is clearly a major question in the United States. I mean, it's we have 12 million undocumented immigrants. Moreover, I mean, as it's not just, that these 12 million undocumented immigrants are just living on their own. One of the things is that they're a mixed status family. So it actually affects much larger numbers of people than those 12 million. So it's kind of an untenable situation in the United States to have that many people who are here without legal status and who are still coming. Now, one of the questions we can discuss is that's being raised is how is the current economic situation going to affect continued inflows, or how does it affect outflows? Does it mean that there's some evidence, and it's not great yet, as to that people are going back home because they can't get work here, and that perhaps the flow will be reduced because the U.S. economy is in such bad shape and there aren't jobs. We don't really know yet. There seems to be some evidence of a slowing down, but it's not going to disappear, and everyone's not going to go back home. And if things are bad here, my feeling is that they're probably worse where they're coming from. And we know from a large literature, for example, on rural to urban migration in Africa and Latin America, that even when there's high unemployment in cities, people still come from the rural areas, and I suspect that that's still going to happen. So I'm rambling on, but I think that's because I think this is a huge and important issue in the United States. And as Jamie said, and she mentioned briefly her own work, and one of the most important things that's been going on in the last 10 years in the United States has been the spread of immigrants to these, quote, so-called new destinations, and which is also having, important effects. So.
Yeah, as one of the last European immigrants to the United States. Your three-generational thing.
Yeah.
The people who come in and it's okay. But they need to take it. Oh, I see. It's really rather dangerous to take it. Three-generational thing.
Oh, for linguistic assimilation.
Immigrants come in, they maybe learn some clunky English, their children go to school, they learn fine English, but they're bilingual, and the third generation is monolingual. And I recall, Herbert Gans, was it, about 25 or 30 years ago, there was a thing called the third generation return, in which it was the second generation who became the great learners of English, and then their children got this romantic idea that wouldn't it be neat to remember the language of the old country?
Yeah,
was that an instant in the 70s and 80s to do, or didn't it really happen?
It didn't really happen.
It was made up?
There was a nostalgia for the, for the parents culture, and,
Right.
and it was more an issue of ethnic identity and thinking of themselves as Italian Americans, or looking, eating Italian food and thinking how great it was, or whatever, which it is, by the way. So but it wasn't language really. I mean, there wasn't a big no. So I don't think that. By the way, when you were speaking, I thought you were going to ask me something else, and I think it's worth saying that today many immigrants come speaking English, so we shouldn't forget that, right? I mean, here I'm studying the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean. I mean, they come, obviously, they're native-born English speakers. Many Asian Indians who come speak English, many Filipinos. So that's also something different from the past, in that many immigrants come. Not that there weren't English people coming in the past, but their numbers were small. So that there are many immigrants coming today who speak English.
I must say to you that there was a moment in my previous life before I came to this university where I was declined on a program in Philadelphia because having heard me speak, the person running it said, "Well, I'm sorry, but we only allow native English speakers." This is true. I did not make that up.
That's xenophobia for you.
Okay, I'm keeping a visual cue, Sarah.
So how did, in 1986, under Reagan administration, he gave Congress. Undocumented immigrants so-called amnesty. So how did that happen under a Republican president, and are there any lessons for today on how to get that done?
Oh, gosh. Well, it was Congress that passed it, and we hadn't had that amnesty yet. I think the political mood of the country is quite different. I think that the results of that amnesty actually might also be fueling concerns about having another amnesty, because it led to a lot of... What happened is not only did undocumented immigrants legalize, but once they legalized, they were able to bring in their children, so it has a snowball effect. That particular amnesty also involved a lot of agricultural workers being allowed. And I think the mood of the country now is... Even the bills that were up, and sponsored by Democrats before it all fell apart, involved sort of punishment, right? I mean, they involved, you had to pay a fine, you had to, go back to the country of origin before you would apply. They weren't as generous. And I think to get something passed now, I think it would be much more difficult. And perhaps that's due to the rising numbers of immigrants. Perhaps it may be due to the fact that immigration is spreading beyond the traditional gateways, and there's perhaps more conflict and difficulties in many parts of America that hadn't experienced large-scale immigration for a long time. I mean, there are a lot of other factors, but if it does come up, I think it will not be as generous an amnesty as it was. No.
I think it's implicit in your list of similarities, but I'd like to suggest that the economic engine drives immigration in both periods. And a good example of the consequence of that is the Cuban immigration and how it's perceived as very different from the rest of Hispanic immigration, because it was not economically driven, but was politically driven, exiles. And so you have a whole different behavior in the part of the Miami Cuban community as compared with the rest of the...
Well, I think that's a complicated question.
It is a complicated
because there are other migrations that were, quote, political. So you could say Southeast Asians who are actually much more numerous than the Cubans. So I think the reaction to the Cubans is partly because their initial migration was such a heavily middle and upper middle class immigration. So it was people bringing good human capital. Because as refugees, well, they got a lot of advantages, as refugees. But I think it had to do with the class background of the earlier immigrants. A lot had to do with that. Because there have been other groups that have come, as refugees where politics was a big factor. I mean, after the Haitian
refugees of the 30s.
It's how they get defined by the U.S. That's another issue.
To play off on that.
Yeah.
The language issue in the early 20th century was I think, equally significant. The Americanization movement, was very strong. The effects and demands on schools to transform immigrant children immediately into Americans.
Yes.
You know, the famous metaphor of the melting pot. So I don't think that has changed.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about that. In fact, if anything, it's changed in a more tolerant direction of other languages. Again, to use the New York example, you know, in New York City schools in New York City 100 years ago had, you know, 40% immigrants, and, you know, most of them were Italians and Jews. In New York City public schools, you were not allowed to speak Italian or Yiddish. They were absolutely banned. You got punished. You were put into, there were practically no programs to assist children who didn't speak English. They were thrown in. If you didn't know English, you know, you were in the first grade, even if you were 12, you know, you're just thrown in. Now, you know, so it wasn't exactly a very sensitive environment. There were practically no classes. They were called steamer classes for very small numbers of children, in which there was about 6 months in which they had, you know, total immersion. That was it. There was almost nothing. Now, the difference, again, from the past is that you didn't need that much education, you know. Very few people 100 years, or maybe 125 years ago, you didn't need much education for a job. Most people didn't have a high school education. There were very few high schools in New York City. Almost nobody went to college. It was, you know, highly unusual. You know, to be a lawyer, you didn't go to college. You graduated from high school and you studied and you took the exams. And that was a high-status occupation. Many occupations, you know, today for which you need a college degree, you didn't need one. Many people dropped out of school at early ages and they went into the workforce. So, you know, education, there's such a premium on education today that learning English is so much more important. And actually, America has the United States has many more programs to facilitate this than it did in the past. Yeah.
Great talk and great response. I guess I'm worried, though, about overplaying the parallels between first and second wave, because, you know, there's a political fallout if you overplay it too much, because then you see immigrants suffering today and you say, well, what's wrong with you? You know, my grandparents suffered too, but they made it. And it seems to me that there's three strong non-parallels. I mean, one is racialization, and previous they were provisional whites who could become white because they were more phenotypically close to white. Today, most immigrants are not close to white. So you have racialization, and you also have the fact that when we accept European immigrants who suffered oppression in Europe, we can feel good about ourselves. It's consonant with the American myth of, you know, of being a liberal egalitarian place. When we accept the Irish or the Jews in particular, who were oppressed in Europe, and the Jews were not accepted for long, but now. But when we accept people who have been who have experienced oppression at the hands of, you know, the United States or global capitalism, it's a fuzzier question. It doesn't ring with, you know, consonant with the American myth. And I think that in the last election we saw that. So the question of political assimilability of these new groups poses challenges to people like Huntington. And then finally the fact that Latino immigrants, I mean, we are in the Western Hemisphere. There is a difference to Latino immigration because we're in you know, two continents that are majority Latino, and so that frightens some non-Latinos for fear that this is going to be different because they can maintain relations much more quickly. So I think these are reasons why the challenges to the political and cultural assimilability that's perceived among this current sector of immigrants. It may not end up in as rosy a picture.
Well, you raise a lot of complicated questions. I would dispute, though, some of what you said. I think there are a lot of differences between then and now, but when it comes to race, I mean, it's really hard to imagine what it was like then. But really, there was tremendous, in some ways, it was more vitriolic than today. I mean, there was really, people didn't, well, there wasn't a myth about how great America was as a nation of immigrants. In fact, historians have been writing, Donna Gabaccia has been written a recent paper on this. She argues it wasn't until the massive wave of immigration 100 years ago was well over, and their children were assimilating. And after World War II, the nation of immigrants became widespread as a myth, as a notion. There wasn't a notion like that 100 years ago. It was like these hordes of people who were ruining America were coming in. Very much, tremendous prejudice against them. I mean, it's hard to think about that because views of them have changed so much. But really, if you look back and you read the material on them, I mean, they were really thought of as plundering America. There was a tremendous, that we don't hear so much. They coming to work, sending all their money home, that they didn't belong. There were movements. In fact, in some ways, it was more vitriolic than now. There were constant movements for restriction. And actually, it got through Congress. It's just in a number of cases, the presidents vetoed them. I mean, absolutely, unions today, actually, the unions were very much against immigration in the past, as they were. I mean, there was a lot of anti-immigrant feeling. And they managed to pass a rather draconian law in 1924, which really restricted immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. So, I mean, I think we shouldn't forget. I agree that there are a lot of new ingredients today, and I think but there was a lot. We shouldn't forget that, the continuities. And yes, there are many of the immigrants today are Latino, so that makes it, and I think the undocumented issue makes it different today. I think many people say, and that becomes a way, I think, in which people today can both hold on to this myth of America as a nation of immigrants and say, immigrants are good and great, it's just we don't want undocumented. Right? I mean, that's often what you hear, right? So that's, it complicates matters, right? But I think, I think we shouldn't minimize the difficulties, that immigrants had in the past, and the very negative views that there were, and also because public discourse was so open and racist. Both towards, and now remember, this was a period in which, we're talking 1910, 1900, African slavery had only ended 40 years before, right? And if we're looking at northern cities, which is where most of the immigrants were, if we're talking 1910, 1900, this is before the Great Migration from the South. So the northern cities like New York and Chicago, in the period in which you're having this huge migration, are largely European cities. I mean, New York in 1910 had about 2% African Americans. That's tiny. It was a city of European immigrants, and that's another thing to think about, and which the European immigrants themselves there was this hierarchy. Yes, there was obviously tremendous racism against blacks and Hispanics to the extent, and Asians. Of course, we shouldn't forget that. Asians were victims of terrible prejudice, and in fact had specific laws not only to exclude them, but they were aliens ineligible for citizenship. They were not allowed to naturalize. So, that's true. That wasn't, in that sense, European immigrants were recognized as white by the law. They were not, anti-miscegenation laws didn't apply to them, and they were allowed to naturalize. And so in that sense, that's another way in which they were in between peoples, right? And therefore and that leads to, I guess, another question I guess Jamie was raising, and I don't have the answer to this, but I think it's one of the key questions. Because if we look at how we say, well, in the past, Jews and Italians, just to use those two groups, who were racialized as inferior whites, okay, and who were not, thought that they would never be able to assimilate. Not only assimilated, that's one question, but they came to be viewed as, I don't know, for a better word, fully white, as part of the mainstream, okay, with, as sociologists might say, where ethnicity was an option, okay, they were not labeled racially. So the question becomes, is that possible today? Okay, or in the future? What will happen today, or in the years to come? And that's really the $64,000 question. And we could say, and I think you sort of alluded to that, what processes were working. Well, one is that they were in between peoples. I should say that that's just one factor. I mean, I think a major factor was their ability to be upwardly mobile and to the educational and occupational expansion of the economy, which allowed them to move up. Some people argue distancing from African Americans, which is something that many immigrants did as a way to emphasize their whiteness, struggles by the groups themselves, the ending of mass immigration, which reduced fears that the nation was going to be swamped by all these immigrants. Now, when people look today, there's debates now about what will happen. Will certain groups become white? Or will the very concept of whiteness change? Will something else happen? Will we get, and Jamie alluded to this, and I've written about, a black, non-black order, which is a very upsetting development if that happens, because that would be, once again, people who are labeled black with African ancestry would remain on the bottom, and other groups, Latinos and Asians, would leapfrog over them. Or will we have another possibility, and these are all just, speculations, get a kind of Latin American situation or Caribbean situation in which class will trump race. We don't really know, obviously, which scenario. Richard Alba, who's a colleague of mine, who actually I've been writing about other stuff with, he's making a strong case these days that the factor that's going to be the major factor generating change is basically changing demographics. Not surprisingly, he's a demographer. But he argues that there'll be smaller cohort, there'll be a lot of whites retiring from the labor force in the future, and given the demography, there will be fewer whites available to even fill high status roles. And he says inevitably this is going to open up positions at the top for people of color. Now, he does raise the issue, maybe, which people of color are going to manage to do this and how this is going to affect racial ideas, but he argues that that's going to be the key generator, potentially, of change in the future. Who knows? We don't really know. I think that what a historical view does, and if we can, it's very hard to sort of put yourself in, what it was like to live in, the United States in 1910, but it does offer us some basis for optimism because, after all, racial views have undergone tremendous transformation and change in the last 100 years. People, I always say, if someone was living in New York in 1910 and came back today, they would probably pass out. They wouldn't believe that Jews were in all the fancy schools, that we had a Jewish mayor, that, that after all, even practically in my lifetime, maybe, certain clubs and didn't allow Jews in, that was not, there was restriction, that was what it was called, okay? And the same with Italians. So, that's been a huge change. There's been a very great change in how people thought about those groups in a way that people 100 years ago couldn't even imagine. So I think, the race, they say, remember, is a social construction. And, I think that events I think there will be changes. The question is, exactly how, we don't know. But to leave it on a somewhat optimistic note.
Something that you said in your response to
Yeah. Yeah.
You brought up the sort of introduction of illegality as something in immigration, how that's very new.
Yeah.
He brought up deportation, but how has that affected sort of immigration more generally, sort of legal immigration, and Americans' attitudes toward that? And to bring in localities to it, I know that there's a pretty extensive piece of legislation passed in Hazleton that's now under scrutiny in the federal courts for implementing pretty draconian provisions against people that don't background check their employees thoroughly enough. And so I'm just wondering, particularly in the wake of 9/11, how this illegal immigration has made the context very different for people who come to this country legally.
How the illegal immigration has made it different for people who come legally.
Yes.
Well, to the extent that it's spurred up a lot of anti-immigrant feeling, yes, particularly in some groups, and I would say Latino immigrants in particular, and particular in certain localities. And here it makes a difference, the context and where they're living. I've argued, maybe I would tone it down a bit. I didn't talk about Jamie alluded to the how exceptional is New York argument. That's always so that I've argued that New York is a fairly welcoming place for immigrants, but I think other cities are fairly welcoming too. San Francisco, New Haven. New York isn't the only place in the world that's unique, but welcoming. But it is pretty welcoming, both on the political front. But I think just because it's a city where 60% of the population, among other things, 60% of the population are immigrants or children of immigrants, and it's certainly a very diverse city and one that is accustomed to immigration as opposed to Hazleton, which is, or I don't know if how many of you read the New York Times today and saw the horrific account of the Ecuadorian immigrant, if you haven't, you should, in Patchogue, Long Island, not too far, if you look at the map, from Farmingville, which is where the Mexicans, right, were they killed, right, a number of years ago, and where the house was put on fire. But this Ecuadorian immigrant was killed by some young teenage boys who said, let's go jump some Mexicans after they were drinking. And they knifed him. In a community where, by the way, where Latino immigration has gone way up. I mean, there's been a big increase, and obviously there's a lot of hostility. I mean, fueled by a number of things. I mean, I think many of the, resentment of day laborers. I mean, that's one of the things in their communities. Many of the people who live in these communities, and I don't know how this relates, at least in Long Island, and this is in Suffolk, for those of you who know Long Island, which is, far out there. It's not Nassau, which is right next to, but it's the next county out. That many, have moved to the suburbs. These are basically all white communities where people move to the suburbs to get away from the problems of the inner city, and then they see the inner city coming to them, where they resent overcrowding in houses in their communities, where Latinos' presence in the schools, and I think the New York Times article talked about and had figures on the growing percentage of Latinos in the schools and special programs. And interestingly mentioned in that article, and I don't know, this is just a reporter from the New York Times, Kirk Semple, I don't know how much time he actually spent out there, probably very little, but still, he mentions competition for work, which is something that, by the way, I would raise in the current situation. In the past, there's been not that much competition between immigrants and the native-born for work. That hasn't, there's a debate about that. But I think on the whole, social scientists would say no, there's not that much competition. But with the economy being what it is now, I wonder to what extent even these low-level jobs that there'll be competition for. And it may be that whites and African Americans as well are going to be much more resentful of immigrants coming in and taking jobs when they can't get work. I mean, that's something that happens, right? So, I mean, and I think that's something that needs to be studied, I think, so far, we've had immigrants in good economy. I've raised that, by the way, in New York City, where I think the same thing holds. I mean, as New York City is really going to get slow. It's Wall Street. It's not helping New York. And I think that New York City, there's a lot of analyses, and I don't know how many of you have read. The argument in New York City has been that, the economy, there's not competition because initially Roger Waldinger's argument that there was a restructuring of the economy and so many whites left and it opened up jobs for immigrants, or Saskia Sassen that there's this restructured economy and these high-level jobs have created low-level jobs, and so even in times of downturns, and we've seen this in New York, there are continued inflows and immigrants get jobs. But what happens now? Because whites are not leaving the city. I mean, that process has kind of stopped. And the restructuring, it's a restructuring in which all the high-level jobs are disappearing. And then what happens to the immigrants who are, driving cabs or, working as nannies? I don't know. I mean, so I just raised that because I think that's an issue that in the current period is going to be on an important one, and how that will feed into feelings towards immigrants, I don't know. So I just raised that.
Since 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq,
another issue,
there have been several million dispossessed people in Iraq, and maybe many hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who have died prematurely for one reason or another. And yet my understanding is that the U.S. has accepted very few Iraqis as immigrants. I wonder if you could kind of explore that immense discrepancy.
Well, there is, yes. Definitely. I mean, the United States has... Now, I don't know, that raises a question under the new administration. My guess is that there'll be big pressure on them from certain of their constituencies to expand the number of immigrants coming in for Iraq. I think we'll probably see more Iraqis coming in as refugees. Yeah, I mean, it's much of America's refugee policy was a Cold War policy, as we know. I mean, it was an those groups who were fleeing communism we allowed in, and those who weren't, we didn't. I mean, the classic case is the Haitians and the Cubans. Haitians were fleeing a dictatorship, Papa Doc, Baby Doc, really dangerous to remain in Haiti, and yet they were not allowed in as political refugees, whereas Cubans were. So there's, and I think there are racial issues, right? And also remember, if you're coming as a refugee, you also have there's a big advantage to coming in as a refugee, because you get all kinds of government assistance, and you're eligible for all kinds of benefits right away. So it's not only that you get legal access to come into the United States, but you also get a whole lot of benefits. So it's more than passing interest. And of course, in the case of Iraq, I mean, it's a case of really, atonement, right? I mean, what's morally right? I mean, I would suspect that there'll be more opening. How much, I don't know, and it will be interesting to see.
I think that pretty much wraps it up.
Right, and with Iraq. I'm not running. It sounds like I'm running for president.
Please join me in thanking Rosa.